Before we begin looking at features that are specific to Node, I want to make sure that you are familiar with the asynchronous nature of JavaScript. When writing code, synchronous lines of code are basically lines of code that are executed in exactly the order that you see them written in your code files. So let's look at a quick example of writing JavaScript in a synchronous manner. So first, I might create an array of numbers, and then after this array, let's write a function, and we'll call this odds. And this function will take an array of numbers, and this function will return a filtered version of the array. So let's do array.filter, and let's pass this function that will take an individual number, and we can just return n modulo 2. And what will happen here is if n is an even number, then 0 would be returned because 0 is the remainder when you divide an even number by 2, and 0 is considered false, so the array will not keep that. Any odd numbers will return 1, and therefore that's considered true, and so only odd numbers will be returned. And so now, and I'm actually going to move this array below this. So we'll say numbers, and then we can say odd numbers, and let's say odds, and we pass it numbers. And then I can go ahead and do console.log odd nums. And this is synchronous programming. Each one of these lines, specifically lines 9, 10, and 11, they are executed exactly as we see them here. So we create our array, we run this array through a function, and we get some value returned, and then we display whatever our returned value is. And if we come back to our console here and I run node async, which is what I've named this file, then you can see that the result here is only the odd numbers from our original numbers array. So this is synchronous programming, which is the way a lot of programming languages work. And JavaScript does too in a lot of cases like this. However, in some cases in JavaScript, things get a little bit different. And this is usually when you want to do something or get something that's kind of outside of the environment in which you're working. And what I mean by this is if you want to just, do some kind of calculation based on some code, that can be done synchronously as we've seen here. But maybe if you want to go to the disk and read a file or write a file or perform an AJAX request, if we're talking about browser-side JavaScript here, or something like that. These are operations that cannot happen instantaneously. We have to wait for some resource to become available. Maybe we have to wait for a response to come back from the server when we're doing an AJAX request. Maybe we have to wait for the file to be opened if we are doing some I/O operation on a hard drive. And in some programming languages, this is done synchronously, as we've seen here. The execution of the code will just halt wherever it is, and it will wait until the response comes back, and then it will continue. However, JavaScript doesn't do it this way. Instead, it will wait for that response, but it will continue on with other code. And so let's look at an example of how this works. And as I said earlier, this isn't something that is necessarily specific to Node, but it's a pattern that you see often in Node. And it's possible, if you haven't done a lot of JavaScript, that you won't have run into it yet. So that is why we have this lesson in here. Now, at this point in your learning of Node, you aren't really familiar with any of the asynchronous APIs that Node has. We are going to learn about those in later lessons, but for now, let's just create a function that acts asynchronous, even though it isn't actually asynchronous. And so what we're going to do is repeat this odds example. But first, I'm going to change the name of this odds function up here. I'm going to change it to odds sync, and I'm going to have to change that where I call it as well. This is actually a pattern that Node uses in a few places. There are several asynchronous functions in Node, and some of them actually have synchronous versions as well. And the function name difference is that they add sync onto the end of those synchronous functions. The asynchronous functions then are kind of the default. So let's create another function here, and we'll call it odds. And again, we take the array or whatever data that we expect to receive to this function, but then we also take a callback function. And inside this callback function is whatever code we want to run that uses the data that would be returned from this function if this were an asynchronous function. So in odds sync up here, what we return is an array of odd numbers. Instead of returning that from the asynchronous version, we will pass that to the callback so that it can do whatever it needs to do with them in here. Now, of course, filtering this array is not an asynchronous thing. We could just say var odd nums equals array.filter, and I will do just like we did up above. However, what we can do in here is kind of simulate the idea of asynchronous code by using a set timeout. So what we can do here is have a function that maybe is going to be called after, say, 1 second, which is kind of a long time, but that's okay. And so imagine that this timeout here is whatever time it would take for our AJAX request to respond, or for our file file to be opened or something like that. And so then inside this set timeout, we will call the callback, and we have to pass it certain parameters. Now, the pattern that is used in Node is a 2-parameter pattern, which means when we create a callback, we will expect it to receive 2 parameters. The first one is the error message, and the second one is whatever data is expected from this function. Now, if there is no error message to pass, which means the asynchronous function was able to run successfully, then we just pass null instead of the error. And so a lot of times you will see a very common pattern is to first look at the error value when creating a callback. And we'll look at that in just a second here. But first, let's create our error. So let's say var error. And let's just make an error occur if there is a 3 in the original array. So we can say array.index of 3 is greater than -1. And if that is the case, then we can say no 3s allowed. Otherwise, we will just return null. And you could make this an actual proper error object if you want. So for example, I could say new error. Why don't we do that instead? So we can create a new error object like that. And then to this callback here, we will pass it error and we will pass it odd nums. And so now let's copy this array from up here and I will paste it down below here. And then what we can do is call odds and we pass it the numbers. But then this time, instead of expecting odds to return some value, we will pass it our callback function, which we will expect to receive an error and data as our 2 parameters. And this is the common callback pattern that you'll see very often in Node code. So we have an error and then data, or whatever you want to call that second parameter. And then the other part of this pattern is usually you'll see something that goes like if error, and then you might have something to handle the error, or in our case, we're just going to go ahead and throw that error. So if there was some error in the execution of this function, that's fine. Go ahead and throw the error. Otherwise, let's just console.log the data. And let's just give it a label here so we know what we're looking at. Data. There we go. Okay, now before I run this code, let me just comment out our previous synchronous code. And now let's go back to the terminal and again, we can do node async, and notice at first there's a pause there, and then we have our error thrown. So you can see we have an error, no 3s allowed. So now let's just remove that 3 from the array. And now notice that there's that 1-second pause at the beginning, which is our faking an asynchronous API, and then we have our data printed out. There are 2 last things I want to point out to you about this asynchronous pattern. First of all, notice that the data that we get as a result of running our function, in this case, it's our odd numbers array that we get as a result of running the odds function, is only available within the callback. There's no way to get access to it outside of that callback. And so that's part of the nature of asynchronous code. Since those values are never returned, you can only get them from within that function. The other thing I want you to remember is that the whole point of asynchronous code like this is that the code does not stop executing when we need to wait for something. So in our case here, this set timeout is what causes this callback not to be called practically immediately, although of course in most cases it won't be a faked asynchronous waiting period as we're doing here. But the point is that during this waiting period, whether it's faked or not, other code will be running. So if I do a console.log and I say this comes after the odd call, and then I rerun this function, notice that pretty much right away we see the line, this comes after the odd call, and then we do wait pretty much the full second, and then we have the data printed out. So while that waiting period is going on, other code that comes after our call to odds is being run. And that is the asynchronous nature of JavaScript. So that is what I wanted to show you with the asynchronous pattern that you will often see in your Node JavaScript code. And also, it's true, you'll often see it in browser-side JavaScript as well. I will mention here that also very common these days, and a really good practice that you should learn, is how to use promises instead of callbacks. You could think of promises as very flexible callbacks wrapped inside objects, and they go kind of beyond the scope of learning just Node, which is the point of this course. Although later on, when we look at some third-party Node libraries, we will look at one of the most popular promise libraries. So promises are something you might want to look up on your own. But this is the asynchronous pattern in JavaScript.